Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast, brought to you by MView, LawView's community for in-house legal professionals, where we dive into the heart of the legal profession to bring you unfiltered discussions with industry titans on a broad spectrum of topics.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast. My name is David Lancelot. I'm your host today. I'm the CLO and EVP Advocacy at LawView. I have the great pleasure to have with me here today Craig Burgess, who is the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of Morehouse College in beautiful Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks for being with us today, Craig.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm very much looking forward to the next, 30 minutes, an hour? I don't know how long we're talking.
2 hours, 3 hours? Who knows?
Yeah,
we'll see how it goes.
I got all day.
I got all day. It's Friday. Why not? So maybe just a quick intro for the audience on how we know each other. We met at a NACOA conference in Denver, and I have to say we had a conversation really quite to the end of the conference, right? And we had a great conversation, and I thought your sort of backstory, your history of moving between different general counsel roles at universities with super varied sort of responsibilities would be super interesting for our audience to hear what it's like to be the general counsel of an institution as storied as Morehouse. Maybe, and that makes me think, like, this podcast has a pretty international audience. Obviously, everyone in the United States knows Morehouse. It's very, very well known. But maybe for our international audience, you could give a quick intro on the college.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those international folks, I'll just say the name Martin Luther King. Obviously, one of the most storied graduates of this institution. But really just the tip of the iceberg of the leaders that Morehouse College has produced over the many, many decades that it has existed since 1867. And we're talking about leaders at the top of the various industries in this country. And that's the amazing thing about Morehouse College, which is a small private institution in Atlanta, Georgia. We have about 2,500 students. We're actually bursting at the seams. The school just started just a couple weeks ago, and we're scrambling to make sure we have room for all the students that want to be here. But what I've been amazed by since I've been here is, again, just the tremendous leadership leaders that this institution has produced over the years. Everyone from, like I said, Martin Luther King, and again, for your international audience, who some of whom have been to America, they probably came through the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, which is named after Maynard Jackson, another tremendous leader and graduate of Morehouse College. If you're a movie buff, I'm sure you've heard of Spike Lee and Samuel Jackson. Two other Morehouse men that walk the grounds of this institution. And if you're into sports and Olympics, Edwin Moses, one of the most celebrated athletes in Olympic history. And the list sort of goes on till we get to this sort of current folks like Raphael Warnock, our esteemed senator from the state of Georgia, who's a Morehouse graduate, to Marlon Kempson, who is a very well-to-do established attorney from South Carolina, and a person who I call a friend, and who is a member of the Biden administration. So I literally could take an hour in this podcast and tell you about all the unbelievable stories of Morehouse men in leadership capacities, not only in the country but around the world. But I know we have other questions.
I think it's maybe that's the other reason why I was so excited to meet you at that conference, is because I know personally a number of Morehouse men, and it just struck me that some of the most impressive people that I've met in Silicon Valley, in the world of sports, right? Most of them lawyers, right? General counsels. Some of them In other parts of the profession, people from Goldman Sachs or from major league basketball teams or whatever, some of whom we've been sort of chatting with recently.
Yeah.
We're all from Morehouse, and I just sort of was like, what is going on? How does this happen? And it's just really neat.
Yeah.
And then to meet you, I'm the General Counsel of Morehouse. I was like, wow, I got to talk to this guy, right? So I think it's really, really neat that you have this role and have this insight into that community and the connection to the community. And we're able to share some of that with our audience and what it's like for you to be there and be the head lawyer on the ground for that, and I struggle to call it a business, but of course it has many of the aspects of a business, with a lot of other stuff going on too. I mean, there aren't that many businesses that have the President of the United States show up at their, commencement, right? That's a pretty significant risk scenario for legal to deal with, right? I didn't have to deal with that at eBay. No presidents were showing up that I know of. We had a few consular officers and things, but no presidents. So really neat.
It really is a unique institution. Morehouse is a historically Black institution, and it's an all-male institution. Speaking as somebody who went to an all-male institution, I'm a graduate of the Citadel, which is a military college in South Carolina. You really see sort of the benefits of that, particularly for African American men. An amazing statistic that I want to share with your audience is, again, Morehouse is a relatively small institution, but we annually graduate more African American men than the 40 top national liberal arts institutions in the country. And that's an amazing thing, and it tells you, and it really sort of demonstrates how valuable an institution like this is, particularly in this day and age. And what I will say about an institution, higher educational institution, the best way to describe it to me is when I try to tell people what I do, it really operates almost like a mini city, because you have all of those things that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis that a large sort of or a small municipality has to deal with. And it's people, it's policies, it's roads, it's real estate. And we're dealing in a situation where all types of people are on our campus every day, from 18-year-olds who've just graduated from high school and don't really know a lot, not very sophisticated, to some of the smartest people in the world, literally the smartest people in the world, with doctorates and who've written books and made discoveries. And so it is an amazing thing to be around and to see the reach that Morehouse has and the gravitas that Morehouse has in the few short months that I've been here has really been an amazing experience.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I've told you that story about I was chatting with one of many university legal leaders, and they told me that universities, colleges, higher education institutions are probably the most regulated institutions in the country for a number of reasons, including the fact that some of them have, nuclear reactors on campus.
Right.
And in my case, at the University of Florida, I can still remember the Absolute Zero lab having some issues, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's not something we had at eBay. We didn't have those sort of concerns. We didn't have roads, police departments, fire departments, hospitals with helicopters landing on them, or any of that stuff. All mixed in with 18-year-olds who don't know how to do their own laundry in some cases, right?
Right.
So I think it's a fascinating place to be, especially for the head of legal.
Yeah.
So why don't we...
I just want to say one thing. You mentioned I was Chief Compliance Officer as well, and in that capacity, we are developing a compliance program. And part of that is mapping out in what we're calling a higher education matrix, is mapping out all of the 364 federal regulations and laws that apply to higher ed. And so there has to be somebody at this, where the federal government actually requires us to actually do something. And so we have to sort of figure out who is responsible for all of these very discrete, complicated laws, regulations, and policies. And it's what makes the job, interesting, but very, very challenging, particularly when you don't have, legions of people that you can hire, at the drop of a dime to assist you with. But, again, part of that sort of complex regulatory environment that all higher education institutions live in.
Yes. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that presentation. I mean, that sounds fascinating to me to hear about that. I love matrices for my sins. I love
share
the risk
it with
matrix. You. Yeah, no, and I'm sure there are a lot of people, particularly in the higher ed community, that would be super interested to hear about that exercise at some point. So, looking forward to that. And I think good segue over to sort of backstory. You mentioned the Citadel. I think, and our audience would love to hear some more about your journey to legal leadership, because obviously you've gotten to a place that many people would aspire to. And I'd like to hear where you started out and how you got there.
Sure. I'm from a little small town in Lake City, South Carolina, that probably no one has ever heard of. And grew up in the projects to a single mother, one of 5 kids. And so I didn't have any exposure to the law, definitely didn't know any lawyers. And I do have this sort of one recollection of watching a TV show called The Paper Chase when I was a young kid, and sort of being fascinated by law school. It was a story about law students in their first year of law school. And it really did fascinate me. But I've always had a little bit of a gift of gab. I've always been sort of an artistic person. And at one point in time, I wanted to be a comedian. And so I learned to do all these impersonations. I can impersonate everybody from President Reagan to Walter Cronkite, to Carl Sagan, to Morgan Freeman. But I couldn't write a joke. So I had to figure out and do something else. And so eventually, being an English major in college at the Citadel and having a really strong pre-law program, I was drawn to it and decided to go to law school after a couple of years working, and had the great fortune of doing fairly well in law school and landing a job in big law, working for Nelson Mullins, Raleigh and Scarborough. I actually went back to Charleston, a place that I loved, and worked there for the first 11 years of my career, and went from associate to partner, and really had a great time there. And in fact, tried more cases during that period of time than anybody else at the firm. And as a first chair attorney, I never lost a case. And I never really actually thought about that until much, much later. And I was like, wow, that was something that was pretty amazing. I mean, I tried cases. I was a trial lawyer, and I was very successful at it. And I loved being a defense attorney. And I never thought I would leave until I just got a call one day out of the blue from Bell South in Atlanta, Georgia. And I always wanted to live in Atlanta. And I just decided, hey, let's take this opportunity, and went to work for Bell South. And then after it merged into AT&T, I decided to take the severance package when they downsized. And again, for a poor black boy from Lake City, South Carolina, who never had a huge chunk of money, when they sort of flashed that severance package in front of me, I was like, hey, I think I might want to do this. I was single at the time. And what happened was I ended up taking about 2.5 years off, and not practicing law except for, a little bit of individual stuff here and there. And I traveled extensively in Europe and Central America, and particularly in South America. I've been to Brazil probably about 15 to 20 times, to the neglect of sort of seeing more places in the world. But it was a tremendous time. I learned a lot about myself, met a lot of different people, and really sort of explored and had the opportunity to explore, which I never had at any point in my life. The interesting thing was the timing was terrible, because I left Bell South and AT&T in 2007, right before the recession. And so at some point after my AT&T stock dropped from about $40 to, about 10, I realized I had to get a job again. And here's the thing where I think it gets really interesting. So I'd always been, in college I performed well, and in law school I performed well, and I always had multiple opportunities, multiple companies saying, hey, come work for us. Well, in the heart of the recession in 2009, when I put my resume back out there and went back to my old firm, there weren't, the opportunities were gone. I remember talking to a recruiter because I wasn't getting a lot of successful, people calling me back and saying, hey, come interview. She said, Craig, for all of these corporate gigs, because my initial thing was I wanted to go back in-house. She said, we're getting 400 or 500 resumes for every single job. That's how tight the market was. And these are graduates from Harvard and Stanford. And so the competition for a job was intense. And so what ended up happening is I went back to Charleston and decided, hey, let's look at it a little bit differently. Went to a small firm called Barnwell Whaley and Patterson and Helms, and really sort of reconfigured my practice. Instead of working on these big, giant national cases, I started to do local work, municipal law, representing municipalities, representing counties, and also representing my alma mater, the Citadel, in employment litigation, which actually then led me to my first gig in higher ed when the executive vice president of the Citadel became the president of South Carolina State University, which is another historically Black college in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And I went there thinking, hey, I'd do this maybe for a year or two and go back into private practice. But I really enjoyed it. And I really feel like, South Carolina State at the time was under tremendous pressure. They had accreditation challenges. They were under investigation by a number of agencies, including the state government of South Carolina. And we really actually came close to closing because of accreditation challenges by our accreditation agency, SAC-COC, who actually had us on probable cause. And if anybody out there understands higher ed, probable cause by your accreditation agency is basically saying you have a very limited time, probably about 6 months, to get your act together, or we're going to take your accreditation. And that is the death knell for a higher education institution, because if you are not accredited, your students are not eligible to receive financial aid. And an institution cannot survive if their students are not receiving financial aid. But that was my first foray into higher education. And I feel so great about that because I was able to bring, for an institution that was in crisis, I was able to bring sort of all those sort of litigation skills because there were a lot of sort of adversarial proceedings that were going on against state regulatory bodies, federal regulatory bodies, and you had to know how to deal with them. Sometimes you had to push back, but sometimes you had to be sort of very cooperative and say, hey, what can I do to make this better? And, there was one instance where I really thought that, my role as a litigator in understanding the whole picture, I think that's a skill that lawyers bring. They can see sort of a wider view than people who might have just come up in higher ed. And part of my success, I think, as a trial attorney was sort of seeing that big picture. Whenever I got a case in, I would actually start projecting what would happen if this case goes to trial. And that was the thing that I was most proud about, that I was able to really inform the board about the serious trouble that we were in with our accreditation agency, and really spurred them on to do the things that were necessary. And the school actually did regain its accreditation. They never lost it, but they got off probable cause, and they are striving and a very viable institution currently. And then that led me to Columbus State University, where I worked for the last 7 years and created the Office of Legal Affairs, Ethics, and Compliance. Started off as an office of one ended up as an office of 7. And I'm sort of doing the same thing here at Morehouse. We had a model. We didn't have a general counsel, and we were essentially using an outside law firm to handle matters. That, of course, could be a pretty expensive endeavor. And so the president decided that, hey, we needed to bring a general counsel in-house. And so I've been here for the last 8 months and slowly am building a team. We're getting ready to hire an associate general counsel and a paralegal. And so I'm very excited about that because it will allow me to maybe get to bed a little bit earlier than I normally do.
Wow. So, I mean, there's so much there. I'm going to rewind just a little bit for the audience because I think, we'll have GCs, we'll have in-house lawyers, some in higher ed, some not, and then we'll have law students. And I'm thinking of my law students at University of Florida, and I've told them a number of times, like, travel when you can, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you want to work internationally. But I think also, if you want to work, you were talking about some of the smartest people in the world, right, are on your campus. Having a perspective of the world, like you do, I have to say, I've never been to Brazil, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that, right? But, one of the largest and most important countries in the world, right? Like having the ability to say, oh yeah, I've been to Brazil 15 times, is just fantastic when you're talking to that professor from Brazil.
Yeah.
Or Portugal.
Absolutely.
Or anywhere,
or
frankly.
Panama.
Yeah.
Or some of the other places that I've been. Yeah,
Indeed. So I think for the students in particular, like taking time out, or even people who are in in-house roles, and I speak to GCs frequently who are like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. For me, it's okay to take a break, right? It's okay to learn more about the world and yourself. That is actually a very valuable thing to put on your resume.
Mm-hmm. Well, you gave me the idea. I've never put it on my resume or my LinkedIn profile, but I'm going to update it to do so now.
Yes. I think you've got enough on there already, Craig. I think you're doing fine. But I think it'd be really interesting to see, especially the places that you choose to go, right? It says a lot about you, whether you go to one place or another place and how much time you spend there and that sort of thing. So I think that's super interesting. And then I think second rewind point is moving from a private practice role in a place as beautiful as Charleston, South Carolina. And I think anybody who doesn't know Charleston should know that when Craig talks about having been in Charleston, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous city on the ocean. Amazing oysters in Charleston. But moving from that private practice environment into in-house and taking a role which was clearly extremely challenging, right? Like this wasn't hey, just slot in for a GC who's built an amazing function and sort of just keep flying the flag. This has come into a situation that is probably pretty scary and turn the thing around, right? Sometimes I think the lesson there is probably sometimes it's those kind of opportunities that allow you to step from one world into another one successfully.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think particularly in that case, because, when I went to, again, my first higher ed institution, there were so many things in flux. We didn't have a general counsel. And so it gave me the opportunity to sort of develop my own sort of game plan. It gave me the opportunity because I didn't have anyone sort of directing. It was basically, hey, figure this stuff out. And again, having had that 11 years of being a lawyer where you figure things out, where I was sort of a generalist. I didn't specialize in any one particular area. And so sort of whatever came in the door, I was ready to learn about. One of the trials that I had was representing a utility company. And I was an English major in college. And so it was a wrongful death case where a young boy was killed from carbon monoxide poisoning. And so I had to learn all of those sort of scientific concepts, technical concepts, and ended up trying the case and getting a defense verdict. So it's those kind of skills that you develop as a litigator And again, the great thing about it was I wasn't doing any one particular kind of thing. It was doing a wide variety of things. And that came in handy when you have to deal with one day the inspector general just walking on your campus and demanding documents and demanding to interview people. And the next day you're getting a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office demanding documents and wanting to interview people. Those kind of things, you have to have sort of that broad view, but you also have to have confidence. I was yelled and screamed at by the inspector general. I mean, literally in my face because he didn't like, what I was telling him. But I felt confident enough that I was right legally. And, despite his vociferous pushback, I held my ground. And that litigation experience that I had really was important in terms of having the confidence to do that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think my blood pressure has gone up listening to their story. So yeah, that's you're making me think of when the Italian tax police come and tell everyone, don't touch your briefcase. And of course, this is Italy, so they actually had briefcases. But that's one of those situations where everybody else in the room is glad to have the person who's calm under pressure, even though your blood pressure is probably going through the roof. You've got the experience to say, okay, everyone, let's cooperate, frankly. So I think off the back of those three moves in-house, you probably have a model now for when you come into a higher ed in-house environment and how you think about what's best practice, let's say, or what's at least Craig's practice for designing the function, standing it up. So could you tell us a little bit about how you think about that and how you're thinking about that now at Morehouse?
Yeah, I think the model I've developed is really coming in and not trying to impose sort of a predetermined plan of action. Every institution is different, and particularly the case here at Morehouse, where there is a sort of Morehouse culture, a Morehouse sort of way of doing things. And even though, I may have this belief that I know what's the best way to do it and how to do it, I think it's really important to understand and get to know the people that you are going to be working with, particularly those people who have sort of put their blood, sweat, and tears into this place. You want to make sure that you value people from the top down, from the president to the young woman who comes in here and empties the trash can. Everybody has a valuable role to play, and even though they may not operate exactly like you do, even though they may not have the expertise that you do, there is something valuable that they can provide in terms of their skill set, but also in terms of their sort of knowledge. As a lawyer, that's what I find sort of most valuable is people who sort of understand what's going on and can give me some perspective before I make decisions. So it's really important. I've been here 8 months now, and we're just now really starting to make some changes, from, instituting, our new matter management system to beginning the first sort of writing the first contours of our overall sort of compliance program. But again, it's really important to me to make sure that you understand the institution first and how it works before you go making these major changes. And I can tell you, I'm doing a lot of things much more different than I did, just at my immediately preceding gig at Columbus State University, because again, we're at a different type of institution, and the way I did things there just would not necessarily work. And that's my philosophy. Go in, figure out the place, get to know your colleagues, not just on a professional level, but a personal level. It's important, that you ask people how they're doing, how their kids are doing, and I think I generally am well received because I think people perceive me as a person who is not just here to make a buck, but really wants to better the institution and wants to have meaningful relationships while we're here, 9-10 hours a day.
Sure. And I think I'd call that being approachable and accessible.
Yeah.
And of course, being engaged in the mission of the institution. I think that's probably an evolution from a model that I've seen in sort of a more commercial environment, I guess you would call it, but also what I've heard about from other university GCs, where we're evolving from a situation where the lawyer was almost seen as an academic, almost as a basically external counsel, right? External counsel sitting in-house, providing advice on purely legal matters, and then going back to the sort of wood-paneled office to enjoy a fine, glass of port, as opposed to a more modern model, which is clearly what you're espousing, which is, in the trenches with the business. And I would totally agree with you on your point about like from top to bottom. I think in the United Kingdom we'd call that knowing everyone in the post room, right? And often
in the post room,
like where the mail comes in, the mail room, I guess you'd call that in the States. Right? Never really thought about that, but knowing the people, the posties often have the most valuable insights into how the organization functions, right? And they'll tell you, unlike some of the more political actors, they'll tell you to your face. So I think it's super, super important to build rapport and show your accessibility in all quarters of the institution, as you say.
Yeah, I think, in higher education, the lawyer is just purely the advisor is not sufficient. Sure, a lot of what I do is advisory, and I actually try to stay in my lane. When it comes to student affairs issues, when it comes to institutional advancement and the raising of money, I can't tell those folks how to do their jobs. I can advise, but there are opportunities to be a strategic partner. And part of my role is operational in terms of the compliance functions and instituting a compliance plan. But as a general counsel, you have to be there in the cabinet meetings. We call our group the strategy group. You have to be there in those strategy meetings, and the lawyer has to talk up, and not just about legal matters. Because again, one of the trends in higher education is you finding a lot of more and more lawyers becoming presidents of institutions, and I think that's a trend that will continue. I think that's a trend that will increase because lawyers bring a certain ethos and a certain way of thinking, and we bring a lot of skill sets because higher institutions, yes, they're not for the most part, they're not for-profit businesses, but you kind of sort of have to run them, at least to some extent, with that mindset. And so it's important for lawyers to be at the table when those big decisions are being made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that's obviously a trend that we see in business as well, where you have general counsels, legal leaders moving from purely legal roles to taking on, HR operations, where we're particularly well suited to manage those, compliance, obviously, government relations, but then also into the, COO role and also into the CEO role. I actually know some lawyers who've taken on the CFO role. Can you believe it? Yeah, I know. It takes a special lawyer to run finance. I know, and that's sort of turning the tables on our finance colleagues, right? Because often they're pipped to run legal for some reason. So it's definitely a trend, and it's really interesting to me to hear that's a trend in higher education as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes a ton of sense, as you're saying. So maybe you could tell us where, you've had a varied and multifaceted journey. Did you feel at any point that you had a role model for how you operate as the GC at an institution like this? Did you attend a seminar or read a book or anything that gave you some guidance there?
Not really. And again, it's part of the 3 jobs that I've had. I've gone in where there's sort of nothing in place. And so, had I worked at a Georgia Tech or a Harvard where, you had an established infrastructure in place and lots of attorneys, assuming I went in as, an associate general counsel or something, I probably would have an answer to that question. But from my first gig to my second gig to now, I've been tasked with sort of building up the program. And so I've never specifically had a role model, but certainly over the years, well, I would say probably the role model that I had was back in private practice. The guy who was probably the most instrumental of bringing me in, Richard Farrier, who happened to be a former Citadel football player. So, we were 2 big guys. I'm 6'6". He was, 6'3", but, much bigger, brawnier than I. And so he was perhaps my most significant role model in terms of how I practice law and sort of the compassionate way that I think I approach the practice of law. And that is, I think, continued in terms of my roles in higher education.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to put it. I like the word compassionate because it gives you that sort of, openness and curiosity. And I'm trying to think of the modern, the emotional intelligence that we keep being told we need to have to do our jobs these days. Is basically about compassion, right? Like actually caring about how other people's lives are going and how you can better the situation of their lives and the institution. And I'd include in that the people on the legal team, right? Because I think the reason this is called the Legal Leaders Podcast is because you're a leader, right?
Yeah.
You're a functional leader. And I think for quite a long time, in-house lawyers and particularly sort of more old-fashioned general counsel have thought of themselves as purely substantive experts, which has led in some cases to their teams not having a leader in the sense of a compassionate leader who actually cares about the people who work for them, right? As opposed to, whatever constitutional law doctrine is sort of interesting on that day.
Higher ed sort of leads to that. We are, particularly when you're dealing with students, and there has been over the past decades more of a focus on students' mental health, student well-being, and you're very cognizant of that when you're dealing with students. I actually don't have a tremendous amount of contact with students. No, I have some. I just helped a student recently who was putting together a business conference, and he needed a sort of a standard sponsorship agreement. So I helped him with that, but I also directed him to say, hey, you need to confer with our strategic marketing team, and you need to make sure the student services folks are aware of what you're doing and sign off on it. But there has been this shift, this sort of monumental shift, and part of sort of that federal regulatory structure that I was talking about. Part of it is the increasing focus on really making sure students are getting their money's worth, making sure that they're getting the right type of education, making sure that they're safe from harassment, sexual assaults, things like that. And so you have this focus by both federal and state authorities on ensuring that this environment, which can be very intimidating. Again, if you're taking a student who's from sort of the back hills of South Carolina, like I was, and inserting them into this environment with very sophisticated people, there's an imbalance of power, and so you really do have to be mindful of that, and I'm mindful of that. And when you're dealing with students who are, particularly now, I think in this age, coming out of this sort of COVID area, and sort of some of the emotional and mental health challenges that has wrought, you have to. That's the approach that you have to take with your colleagues. I was just in Washington, D.C. for a conference, and I went on the campus of George Washington University, and I picked up their university newspaper. I can't recall, but on the front page was an article about a survey that the staff council had just conducted. And the results of the survey essentially was how much stress the staff was under with all of the requirements of the university, of the federal government, of perhaps the DC government. They just felt under tremendous stress. They felt they didn't feel like they were valued enough. They didn't feel like they were being paid enough. And you find that and you see that at a lot of colleges and universities because colleges and universities are sort of at the center of some of the divisiveness that you see around the country, particularly on the political level. There are lots of people that are questioning the value of higher education. There are lots of people who believe that incurring tens of thousands of dollars of debt is not worth it today. And for some people, that's absolutely true. But those stresses, that pressure, is not only being felt by students; it's also being felt by the people who have to work in environments where you are increasingly being asked to do much more with less and less resources, and that makes this a volatile type of environment. And I think you probably can, when you look back at what happened over the last few months with some of the protests that were occurring on campus, some of that probably could be laid at the feet of how difficult and to some extent divisive that institutions of higher education have gotten.
Yes. No, and I think you're right. And I think that's very insightful, right? From somebody who's been on campus and been in the position that you're in, that sometimes it just takes, and we've seen that in a number of countries, right? I'm thinking of Britain recently. Any of the France, some other places I think of, it takes an issue to sort of release the pressure. Yeah. And outsiders are often surprised that there's why do they need to riot? Right? Why is this rioting happening over this issue, which seems relatively minor? Well, that's because there's so much pressure that needs to be released. And it's, I think back to my days in law school in particular, and just the amount of pressure that you're under and the professors and the institution itself, just in a constant way. And then now these days, as you say, adding the politics on top. I mean, I think there's always been politics in education, right? Like, right. It's kind of silly to think that there wasn't politics before, but in the world we live in with the communication options that we have, it just ramps it up and makes it super public. So just another thing that the General Counsel and your team have to deal with on campus that most other GCs who are outside of that sector aren't spending a lot of time on, frankly.
Yeah.
So, fascinating, Craig. Thank you very much for all of your insights. Real tour de force, and really looking forward to seeing you again. And and thank you everybody for listening to the Legal Leaders podcast, and we'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed listening, please hit follow and leave us a review on your listening platform of choice. We love engaging with our community and hearing from you, so please head to inview.lawview.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.